Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this edition of the Prajnya Gender Talks. It gives me great, I'm looking for the right word for that, to fill that blank. It gives me great joy to welcome Sameera Khan to this edition. Sameera is an old friend of Prajnya. Prajnya is 15 and Sameera has been working with us in various capacities for 10 of those 15 years. So I think old friend is exactly right. She's somebody we count on. She's somebody whose name goes on our lists almost immediately. And finally, we have her to do one of these sessions. So now comes the formal introduction, which, as you know, we make a point of doing in great detail because women deserve full introductions. Sameera Khan is a Mumbai-based independent journalist, researcher, and co-author of the book Why Loiter, Women and Risk on Mumbai Streets, Penguin Random House, which examines women's access to public space. A journalist for more than 3 decades and a former assistant editor with Times of India, she has taught a master's level journalism course at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences and written a regular column on women in the city in the Hindu newspaper. For the last decade, she has also been a media trainer, guiding journalists on how to cover violence against women, particularly rape. She won the National Ladli Media Award for Gender Sensitivity 2020 for her consistent engagement as a teacher, trainer, researcher, and a journalist in promoting sensitive reporting on gender-based violence. In March 2021, she led and co-authored the research study, Locating Gender Perspectives in COVID-19 Reportage in India, an analysis of print media, March 2020 to September 2020, which looked at how the Indian print media across language and region covered the COVID-19 pandemic with a gender perspective. In April 2022, she consulted and helped write the research study, Gender Sensitivity in the Coverage of Rape in the Indian News Media, 10 years after the Nirbhaya case, which examined the reportage of 8 rape cases in the decade after the Jyoti Singh gang rape. Her current research interests include media, gender, Muslims, and Mumbai. She has an MS in journalism from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, New York, a diploma in social communications media from Sophia Polytechnic, and a BA in anthropology and history from St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. Welcome again, Sameera. We're so very happy to have you here. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Prajnya and Swarna, for inviting me to Prajnya Gender Talks this morning. Just a second, this won't start. Yeah, I'm trying to pull together in this talk some of my scattered thoughts on media and gender, specifically as to how today's mainstream Indian print media covers women and other marginalized genders in the English language press, but also in several Indian languages. In this talk, which I hope will eventually move into a conversation between those of us present here, I will share findings from 3 major research studies related to gender and the mainstream Indian news media that were conducted in the last 2 years and that I was glad to be part of. One of them, which is a smaller study, was exclusively done by me earlier this year. The other 2 are bigger studies. One of them I led with a very able co-researcher, Dr. Shweta Singh, who I was hoping will be here soon. And another one was where Shweta Singh led the research, the rape one, and I was a project consultant who was then pulled in as almost as a co-author and research on that. Very happy to say that what was very exciting about the larger 2 studies is that women journalists from across the country were the key researchers in these larger 2 studies. The idea today is to draw upon this data, which is qualitative and quantitative, and discuss current trends in gender coverage, non-coverage in the Indian media. So let me start by presenting my conclusion. My conclusion first. For the fact that we're in 2022, I find the pictures quite abysmal and worrying.
One sec, Sameera. Amita, will you mute everybody else, please?
I am muted. No, I'm muted.
Thank you. Okay, so let me start by presenting my conclusion first. For the fact that we are in the year 2022, I find the pictures quite abysmal and worrying. And I will show you with data from these studies how that is so. Okay, at the onset, let me acknowledge that all three studies were commissioned by and supported by Population First, Lardli, who's very interested not just in giving the Lardli Awards for gender coverage, but also to see how can we improve that picture? Where do we need to make more interventions than other places? So the first study which I did earlier this year was on the mainstream media and gender quarterly review. They got a quarterly review Jan to March, and then it was supposed to go on to other journalists doing in other parts of the country. And I'm not sure the status of that, but I did it from Jan 1st to March 31st, looking at 3 major English language dailies from Mumbai. And I studied everything from page 1 to the last page, every bit of news on those pages. And I had never, you know, if I'm a journalism teacher, I teach journalism, but I had never actually looked at like 270 plus paper from first page to last page every day. And it really opens your eyes to certain things. It doesn't shock you, but it does surprise you. The other study was, which Rana mentioned, the Locating Gender Perspective in COVID-19 Reportage India. This was a massive study done with the help of Population First, Network of Women in Media India, UNFPA, and the Royal Norwegian Embassy, who supported us. And it was you know, the whole first phase of how the COVID-19 coverage covered with regard to gender was what we looked at in 12 mainstream publications across the country in 7 languages. The third study, which was done, which was released earlier this year, Gender Century in the Coverage of Rape in the Indian News Media 10 years after Nirbhaya, which is going to be 10 years this December, was basically where Population was interested in seeing whether, you know, rape coverage had actually changed since the coverage of the December 2012 gang rape case. And this was led actually by Dr. Shweta Singh. I was a project consultant who trained the researchers, and then I came in to help look at the data and write, you know, write the report. It says sort of all these. This is a very important caveat. They all looked at mainstream Indian only print publications. We've not looked at broadcast and not looked at digital media, except for the third study did look at certain amount of digital media as well. News sources. In these print publications, the researchers looked only at the news pages and not the opinion pages. And this is very important to understand, because that's why sometimes you say, okay, you know, I've seen these kind of stories, or why are you saying this? It's because maybe you've seen them in digital publications, very progressive publications, magazines, but you've not really, you know, they're talking about the mainstream regular papers, which most cities, most people are supposed, you know, reading. Of course, studies are needed in all these other domains as well, and I would, you know, be very happy if people took this up. Okay, so let me start with the key findings of the studies. So this first one, which I did in Jan to March this year, looking at 3 major mainstream papers with the Mumbai editions. And that's why it can't be, you know, you have to realize this is important. This is what the nation is reading, really, when they are reading. So the idea was eventually to do the review is to select, I had to help select 5 best gender-related news stories in these 3 months. What would it? And so I looked in depth at them. I looked at physical copies. I actually physically got these papers, and I actually get them anyway. But I looked at them. So every day I could see the placement of the news, where it had played up, whatever. So the task to choose the best gender-related stories turned out to be not that easy. Not because there were too many gender-related news stories to choose from, but because there were too few gender-related stories in the leading dailies of the country. Also, I wasn't necessarily looking at women-specific issues, whatever. That's my big problem with this issue. There's some things are women's issues and other things are, you know, general or men's issues or whatever. But I'm looking at all stories. I'm looking at the court reportage. I'm looking at, you know, sports. I'm looking at business. I'm looking at all those areas to see other women's voices, you know, their perspective from women or other genders or whatever. Particularly if it is reporting on them. But even if it's not reporting on them, it's the budget. I mean, you know, whatever. So it didn't shock me, as I said, but it definitely surprised me that these are leading English dailies from a very major metro. It was no surprise to find that the bulk of the gender-related stories involving women, trans people, and those of other marginalized genders were on crimes against them. usually sexual assault, murder, and quite a few in cyber crimes as well, because this was the period we had that bully by deals issue as well in January coming up. There were also reported stories where women were identified as perpetrators of crime. That women are mostly covered by the mainstream media in the crime genre has been a trend for quite some time now. And I will discuss this later when I talk about, rape coverage. When you flip through a newspaper, you don't immediately realize that women and other marginalized genders are missing from the pages. This is because women and girls are often featured in the glossy photographs, particularly in the feature supplements attached to the mainstream dailies. Even in the COVID-19 coverage, as I will show you later, more women featured in images accompanying the pandemic coverage than in actual text stories on COVID. This was also visible in stories during the period under this period study, Jan to March. Now, if there were gender-related news stories, they usually appeared on the front page or on city pages. Barely any gender-related stories were noticeable in the economic or business sections. Hardly any story was noticed, for example, on women and work. Except in one case where a news story reported on a seminar sponsored by the media house itself on gender responsiveness in the country's economic recovery and bouncing back post-COVID. The same was true of political pages. Now, this was very surprising since this period of analysis, Jan to March this year, was coincide with assembly elections in 5 states. Even on we could see, we had a couple of stories, and it's possible because Maharashtra was not in the assembly election states at that point. Now it'll be interesting. But these were major states, coming up election, including UP. And so the point is there was the 1 or 2 stories on girls marathon organized by, say, Congress in UP, and a stampede in shows as a result. 1 or 2 stories on women being denied tickets, particularly in Punjab, and there were not enough women candidates. But very few stories. They did not. And then after the result, there was a story on how women boosted the BJP to victory in UP. But really, I had to hunt for them. Often what is very interesting is, so either they're not covered, or they're less covered, or they're covered in very particular ways. Okay, and sometimes you can see a kernel of a good story, and then it's lost. Like either the sub-editors cut it out, or they didn't do enough report. Or it's just a new data survey comes out, like a crime survey or something. And women are mentioned at survey by a non-profit organization or something. That data will be put in, but there'll be no voices of women commenting or talking or discussing. So very little of that. A lot of this is happening on opinion pages, which I'm not looking at for this time. So even on the sports pages, very few gender-related stories were visible. If one saw women-related stories in business, politics, or sports, these usually featured an individual woman, the poster child, who excelled in these fields, who had made it through the system. Systemic gender-related stigma and barriers were alluded to very rarely on these issues, though a lot of importance was given to portraying the individual woman as an exception in the larger field. So, example, like Sania Mirza at this point had announced her retirement from tennis. So, just about, what a kick-ass girl she is. Though stories related to women's health were visible in a decent proportion, few stories were visible on the issue of women and girls in education, besides the Muslim girls and hijab issue relating to pre-university institutions, Karnataka, which also came up in February this year. But in many stories, this was covered. For example, the Karnataka hijab issue was covered more as a political issue than as an issue affecting the long-term education of minority girls. Trans people, queer people were largely absent in the news stories in these months. I didn't see. I was desperately looking for references to finding them. Of course, there were exceptions, and those are the exceptions we gave awards to. So, for example, I wanted to share some of these exceptions, which actually it's a good idea to also share what is working and who's doing it. So, for example, this one by Rupsa Chakrabarti. Shows metros show gender gap in vaccination, more men get jabbed. This later got picked up by many other people, but this was one of the earliest stories on it on Jan 24th, where she's saying more women are getting less vaccinated than men. And it has all the, what is interesting, not just the subject, it's interesting, but is and a great perspective and Express playing it up on the front page, but also that she has different, you have the data, yes, but it's not restricted to that. We have other things coming in. We have voices of women, gender rights experts, academic, non-profit background people. So we have ordinary women. And there's a whole illustrative example of a woman who's denied a vaccination in a family flow. So it has all the elements. It makes it, it's data friendly, but it's also very, sort of relate to the story more easily because there are really examples and voices. And this is really critical because many people are missing voices, which I'll come to again later. The same journalist also did another story on M East ward, which is the poorest ward in Mumbai city, by accessing RTI and and getting data on maternal mortality, maternal health being a big problem in M East ward, and used multiple voices, data, the combination. And they Express have played up the story. There was this other story in Hindustan Times which talked about by Joydeep Thakur, talked about the child marriage and trafficking in the Sundarbans. It was part of a series of articles which HT did, which is a good series on education, how education be affected, particularly by COVID, and particularly on marginalized populations, how education marginalized populations. And so this was an area, a remote area, looking at what had happened as a result of education, cut the whole other sort of violence against women rising, particularly child marriage and trafficking. Then there was this story in Express, which was a great story on a Sunday, right in the middle of the front page, and at the height of the hijab and Karnataka issue. It's one of the few stories, actually, I have to say, because I've really been researching this issue, which really, I thought it's a very timely story. This is very important. It's in the middle of this debate, heated debate, where people are taking political positions, but this through data is showing that there is a huge upsurge in Muslim girls' education in the country and upsurge in Karnataka itself. So they looked at both these data and they talked about that. They talked about that this is the context that the hijab ban cannot erase these, should not be seen as something which can erase these gains. And I think that's why it was a very interesting data story, came at the right time looking at that. And the other one was another one, HT story on no pension for women officers, the short-term women officers in the army who had not, despite a Supreme Court order, had not got the pension for more than a year. And this story just highlighted it. Within 2 days, there's another story, action has been taken by the army. So this story actually led to action taken on the issue by the army of releasing these pensions. Another one, I was desperately looking for political stories. This was one of the few more, more decent ones, which talked about there were a lot of women lobbying to change the picture and getting women into the political sphere. And this was a story about how they were being trained for leadership roles. So this was, on that. This was this study. Now, this lackluster gender coverage is something which is actually corroborated by the Global Media Monitoring Project, GMP 2020. This matches the findings of that. Basically, since 1995, every 5 years, GMMP, for people who don't know, has looked at the presence and absence of women in news stories and in newsrooms across the world. The 2020 study, which was led by Padmaja Shaw on behalf of the Network of Women in Media India, found that the overall presence of women as news subjects and sources across media dropped to 14% in 2020, from 21% in 2015 and 22% in 2010. The latest GMPP also found that most news subjects and sources, still about 86%, still tend to be men, especially in print and TV, though on internet and Twitter platforms, female subjects were much more present and shown. But still it was like 21%, 29%. In 2010, Amu Joseph and I produced the first GMMP India report, where we looked at print, TV, radio. Internet was not looked at that time by GMPP. Where women as a news subjects were 24% in the print media and 20% on TV and 13% in radio news. We thought these were low, but when you look at the 2020 figure, it was down from like, down to now from 22% to 14%. It's quite shocking, actually. This one is definitely shocking. In contrast, in 2020, the combined figure for women as news subjects and sources in radio news was 5%. And we thought 13% was low in 2010. This is different. While in print and television had 15% women each as news subject, news sources in 2010. So these numbers shockingly indicate a severe decline in women's overall presence as news subject and sources. So it's not shocking as to what I saw in 3 months. When GMBP looks at news 1 day every 5 years, but I looked at 270 plus papers in 3 months, and I found a similar thing, worrying. And I was kept saying, this is 2022. Why are we not seeing enough of this? Why not just all kinds of stories? Why are there not voices of women? To go to the next study, the COVID story, which the COVID report story, which is like sort of much bigger study. because we look at 12 India-based print publications. On the images of those publications we looked at, different editions, different cities, different parts. For example, in English, we looked at Times of India, Bombay, and Indian Express, Delhi. There was Lok Sapta also in Bombay. There was, I think, yeah, Mathrubhumi, Mathrubhumi Malayalam Manorama in Kerala. In Assamese, there was Asomya Pratidin. In Manipuri, there was Hyun Lampao. There was Anand Bazar Patrika and E. Shamai in Kolkata. And yeah, so Lok Sabha Mumbai edition and Sakal Pune edition from Marathi. So there were these 7 language and Hindi, Hindustan Delhi edition, and Dainik Jagran Delhi and Patna editions were looked at. So, you know, so 7 languages, 12 and researchers across the country from Assam to Kerala. And these were the kinds of you know, areas we were looking at. We were looking at in this whole massive coverage media is totally overtaken by COVID. Where are all these other, where you know, where are women, where are trans people, where are they there at all? In which stories are they? Where do they stand out? The important findings of this, we monitored more than 6. So we looked particularly only at COVID coverage. So if there's anything, say, on the India-China border friction, which was then 2020, we didn't look at those stories. We looked at only the COVID stories. In the beginning month, March, April, May, we couldn't find any other story. We could only find it. So a lot of stuff was, again, news stories, not opinion. We monitored 6,110 news stories related to that. And only 4.8% of those stories had anything of significant regard to women or other marginalized genders or on gender issues or perspectives, bought in anything. So looking at everything, women's voices, there's a gender perspective, is there, you know, on what kind of issues. We monitored also by issue-wise, you know, from employment to education to health, everything. So, for example, this is a table just for March, April, May 2020, where it's looking at these publications and the total number of stories on COVID and the stories on gender as part of that. So very low presence of that. You know, if you have time, I'll discuss how we looked at gender, how we looked at those. So despite the popular assumption that English language publications in India are more gender friendly, the study found that publications in all languages, including English, during the period monitored only marginally represented gender concerns and issues during this COVID-19 and the lockdown period. Frequently, women and trans people were absent as protagonists, sources, and experts, sometimes even in stories that directly impacted them. It was shocking as to stories which were directly about them also did not have their voices. So these are unofficial sort of examples, just for March, April, May again. We have looked at June, July, August, September also we have. But these are just for that. And but here you did see when people are quoted news stories, who were not official sources, they usually tended to be men, and Indian language print publications in comparison to English language print publications quoted far less women citizen unofficial sources. So here English did quote more women when it did quote. That's it. The study found, and this quoting less voices from the other thing is similar to findings which in the Luba-Kasakova study, Luba-Kasova study in September 2020. This was studied by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And this researcher who looked at 6 countries, including India, and she studied March, April only, 2020, also found the same thing. In India, they found that men were quoted 5 times more frequently about COVID-19 than women. And earlier, in fact, what was interesting, the researcher was saying that they were already doing another study which they were doing already on media. And then they quickly went to COVID mode and looked at how the media was also covering women's voice in COVID. And they found in the pre-COVID time, news coverage actually had more women's voices. And interestingly, in the pandemic mode, the voices fell. And this is actually really interesting to notice when the crisis mode, you go back into default setting. It's like that. Crisis mode, you go. Otherwise, maybe other people are putting pressure, non-profits are putting pressure, where the women's voices, where the women, these are the initiatives being taken for women, and the media is reporting on them because someone else is doing part of the work for them. But you have a default mode setting, you would say you're covering issue of crisis. You immediately go into say, oh, we're just covering for everybody. We're not picking up, we're not necessarily covering something. But not just, it didn't even matter whether you were covering women specifically, where their voices in the other stories about COVID, health, employment, migration, and I will talk about that. So women's voices were largely missing across all language publications in the biggest media story of the lockdown period about the mass fleeing of migrant workers from cities to villages. They featured in many images from that time, but were recognized by the media more as family members of male workers than as laborers or migrants in their own right. And research is increasingly showing that women are economic migrants in their own right. The picture has changed dramatically. They're not just, there was a time when you said men left for the cities and everything. But so I was looking at other research studies looking at women workers, and their presence was not. The other thing was, do women work? Overall, the study found under recognition of the livelihood issues of women, both in the formal and informal sectors. Now, this is quite surprising because the Consumer Pyramid's household survey data from the CMIE showed that in April 2020, while 35% of men who were working in December 2019 lost their job, more than twice that proportion of Indian women, 70%, lost their jobs. And those 73% of men who lost employment in April 2020 returned to work in August 2020 and continue to stay employed till end of that year. Only 23% of women managed to return and remain employed in the same period. So women lost more jobs and they came back very slowly or did not come back at all. Despite this, the data showing this very glaringly, this is not shown in coverage. We're not seeing women as workers. We're not seeing them. For example, very little representation of this. While several stories talked about the plight of informal workers, only a few mentioned women even when opportunities arose. There were so many stories we saw, there was such a great time to bring in some women's voices or women's work, but it wasn't. It was observed that in cities, women's informal labor was more readily acknowledged by the news media as domestic workers to middle-class families. That's where informal workers are. They're all domestic workers. Though the lens applied to them often missed focusing on their precarity or on issues of discrimination against them. The study found that when English language dailies reported on women and work-related stories during the pandemic, these tended to often center around the urban middle-class women. So when the media reported the burden of unpaid work that fell on women during the pandemic lockdown, this centered around the urban middle-class women and did not include working-class women in ambit. Their unpaid domestic labor was not similarly counted in. And one place where women were recognized as professionals was really the healthcare, as healthcare and essential care workers. That's where you recognize them. But even in those stories, doctors and, as women, doctors and nurses were more recognized than, say, community level health workers like Anganwadi workers. So it's not, they were less recognized than the others. Many women featured in health-related stories as caregivers, patients, and in situations related to pregnancy and childbirth. But often these stories remain limited to an individual narrative of episodes with minimal gendered perspectives offered. A noticeable trend, particularly in the early coverage of the pandemic, was how often the media reported tend to identify and stigmatize women more specifically as carriers and spreaders of COVID-19. This is the Kanika Kapoor case, which was amazing. When we looked at these 7 languages, 12 publications, from Assam to Kerala, she was everywhere. I mean, everybody was playing her up as this, the villain of causing COVID in India. And the only other person who actually could, beat eventually other group was, and no other even male celebrity who later had it was covered the same way. This is an example. I think Kanika was streamed to the early part of the pandemic. The only other group which faces similar thing were Muslim men and what we call the Tablighi men. They were the ones who were stigmatized. So we saw a huge amount of stigma when women, even in stories in rural Maharashtra, we're seeing a woman in the village is implicated, for spreading it, something like that. It's interesting what she did. So that is sort of easier to cast blame on or cast this. Definitely the earlier part of this, there is panic generally, and maybe media is finding its own feet. Okay, the study found very few stories related to education, considering there was a sea change in education. Everybody and the fact that there were so many barriers to education for so many people, and policy and any education and policy which gave a gender perspective. So they didn't bring in girl learners, girl students specifically. However, the study observed a fair amount of news coverage during the period focused on gender-based violence, including domestic violence, child marriage, and sexual assault. Okay, so there was one more thing. Okay, the missing perspectives. I need to talk about the last thing. It's not, we're talking about voices missing, but a perspective, gender justice perspective of saying, these issues. So there's a lot of hard data, information heavy story, which is totally understandable in the early months of the pandemic. And you're assuming that till June, July, it will change because now you're getting out of lockdown mode, but it doesn't change really. You see, even continuing later in the year, the coverage is changing dramatically. Such heavy data-laden story, very fewer stories overall featured people in general, and women and other marginalized gender in particular as protagonists fell even more sharply. Few with gender disaggregated data. For example, if more women are ill but less are hospitalized, what are the reasons for it? You're not, explaining. The other thing is, which I see a big problem even actually in sexual violence stories, is because I train on that, is episodic coverage. Even if it is an issue that concerned women in particular, the tendency was to report it as a single individual narrative or episode, offering minimal perspective analysis. For example, in May and June 2020, we found a lot of news stories about challenges faced by pregnant women accessing childbirth facilities in hospitals during the pandemic and lockdown. Most of these were reported as individual patient stories, and there was no attempt made to probe maternal and child healthcare as a larger policy issue that needed attention. There was a consistent lack of a gender perspective in news stories that featured women or other marginalized gender. So even when you had women in the story, whatever, you didn't think there was a particular perspective, a gender perspective could have helped the story enhance more. For example, there was a story in a Hindi paper from Lucknow looking at online education and reported on how many women teachers and girl students were feeling uncomfortable with online education, with the comments and what the paper called obscene acts of male students during online class. However, the story didn't offer perspective that this was a serious act of sexual harassment and violence against women teachers and the girl students, and that it demanded strict accountability and action by the institution of higher learning or whatever. Similarly, it was a mixed opportunity to bring in gender perspectives was noticed in most subjects when we were covering migration, employment, education policy. So where you made it, not a voice, maybe an image, but you didn't have a perspective that this is okay. So now the third, Swara, do you want to tell me what the time is?
It's now 11. So you've lost.
Okay, great. Okay, fine. So the third study, which was, project lead and the main author was Dr. Shweta Singh, on this gender censoring the coverage of rape in the Indian news media, 10 years of Nirbhaya, where the way to, was basically various surveys have shown that women are usually rarely the central focus of news stories. And as I mentioned, these earlier studies, the recent studies also confirm that. But the Global Media Monitoring Project 2015 revealed that in one category, women were overwhelmingly represented in the Indian media. That is 40% of the news subjects and stories about violent crime were women. Okay. So that is one. So it's partly explained by the fact that there are more crimes against women being reported to the police now. So NCRB 2021 data, which came out just in September, showed that there was a 15% jump in crimes against women compared to 2020. But important to note, so what is important to note in this is not that you cover crime, but how that women are disproportionately represented in news media in all other subjects. But in one subject, there's much more representation in that. So why not in the other subjects? It's not that women are not doing things in leadership, in health, in whatever, education, whatever. But in one subject, it stands out that the coverage is on gender and women, but in other subjects it doesn't matter. So the disproportionate coverage of that. So this is this study. What Population First was interested in knowing, and this particularly to target their own energies in training journalists across the country, has rape coverage changed? Is it changed only in the English media? Has it changed in media enough, or also in language media? So it was looking at 6 languages, 5 linguistic regions, but looking at through the perspective of 8 cases, 5 were done more in depth, 3 were a little less, to look at them and coverage during those in language and English publication. And so what is the quality? So the quantity, clearly we're seeing a huge upsurge in quantity of reporting on rape and sexual crimes post the December 2012 gang rape case. But what is the quality of the reportage? Are they asking the right questions? Where is it? Where do we still need interventions or whatever? And So these were the stories, and we just tried to see, and sorry, the parameters, it was done on based on 8 parameters. These stories looked at gender sensitivity, and then was looked at 8 parameters based on language, sourcing, legal, medical, forensic information, privacy, morality, sensationalism, intersectionality, and gender justice. Okay, so the main findings, the most noticeable, okay, one of the things is that there is clearly, we see a shift in language, gender sensitive, and a more nuanced coverage. There is an attempt to be made by publications, even in languages, towards that. Definitely a good amount of gender sensitive in terms of allowing space to report beyond the usual. And also shift in the language used by much of the news media, not all, because the moments which Petra stood out sensational, but there was some kind of attempt being made. At the same time, there was an appropriation of many rape cases with the Nirbhaya case, such as Nirbhaya 1, Nirbhaya 3, another Nirbhaya, gets visible. This treatment decontextualized the specific details of each case and had the tendency to homogenize narratives of rape. This constant reference to Nirbhaya. Importantly, post-Nirbhaya, it seems that only the most brutal cases with the most injuries get wider visibility, perhaps the reason for such treatment appropriation comparisons. So only certain kinds of cases get more, play than others. There is still issues of bias in terms of differential identity treatment of the perpetrator versus the survivor. And one example of this, for example, in the IIT Guwahati case, I'm not even talking about the court judgment, but in this case, for example, a headline like this, 2 IIT Guwahati students allegedly raped 3 girls. What you don't know is that of the 3 girls, 2 were also IIT Guwahati students. So the whole, identity of students associated with the men, while the survivors have been called girls, and even though one of the key survivors, who gave evidence was a student at IITG, and I think, okay, one of the girls were IITG, but the other 2 girls were university students at another university. The term tended to infantilize them, and also it showed that their professional career identity was not so important. So he was an IIT and they were not, so it didn't make sense anyway. But the way, a lot of stories did, and this is just an example of many stories, you see that differential treatment continues of perpetrator and survivor. Even when journalists are trying their best to, be balanced, give the survivor a fair chance, but it creeps into language if we're not careful and realize training is really critical for this all the time. The other thing is how much you need, again, legal, medical, forensic training for journalists or understanding is right, because often they're not asking the right questions because they don't even know the law has changed, or the courts are not asking for this, about medical evidence or forensic evidence. So, for example, the Hathras case that said, "Oh, she's not raped," but the cop is saying he's not raped because the medical reports. When you know that the medical test on her was done 7 days after the event, the court does not insist upon it. The story does not contest the fact the medical examination of the victim was carried out many days after the rape, when forensic evidence becomes difficult. And more importantly, this is very important, under the new rape law, it is not necessary to corroborate a rape using medical forensic evidence. The courts don't ask for that because of these various reasons. So they can be provided, but doesn't prove that a rape took place or didn't. Now, journalists were not asking these questions. The cop is misleading them, but the journalists are not asking questions because they don't realize themselves that the law is true. So this is another area. The other thing is that most stories in sexual violence we see have a single official male source. Female sources are very few in most of the stories. Other elements were not enough intersectionality. We saw even the way the Hathras case was covered. For example, an interesting observation study came that one is many media outlets choose not to mention caste, but when they did mention caste, they only mentioned the caste of the victim. The caste of the perpetrator was barely mentioned. It's interesting. So where you did mention whose caste was mentioned, whose was not. There was still some amount of voyeuristic sexual language, but also elements of gender justice always didn't find a place. So sometimes they did, sometimes that was brought out, but that probably needs much more work to talk about that. So these were just some main findings, many more findings, and Swarna will put up the links to both these. The COVID study, this are all online, the full study. The first one, this was a 75-page report. The first one is a 100-page report, the COVID one, which goes into each month of the COVID coverage also. There's, March, April, May, June, July, August, September. So they're very detailed. And we're hoping that other researchers can pick up on this, take it and run and do other sort of things with it. So that is a summary of what these three most recent research studies tell us about gender coverage or non-coverage in the Indian mainstream print media across language and region. At the end of 2022, it raises a lot of angry questions. Why are women not present in their full form in all the ways they should be present in the mainstream news media? Why are they disproportionately represented in news stories? So much more stories related to sexual crimes, celebrity news, glossy photographs, but so little in other very key areas such as employment, education, migration, politics, and policy. So they're not covered, they're covered very little or covered in very particular ways represented. Why do we not hear enough women's stories in all kinds of, or women's, voices in all kinds of stories? What are the steps the media needs to take to cover women, especially socially and economically marginalized women, and all other marginalized genders more substantially? And is it merely as simple as talking to more women's sources and quoting them and their concerns across news subject? That is a start, but that's not the end of the journey. Or is it in deepening the understanding that there are no women's issues and general issues, but all issues concern women and their voices need to be heard? So, for example, BBC all have a policy. They don't run a story till 50% of your sources are women in a story. They will not run a story on any subject. So when they launched that, that's radically changed the way they cover things. Do we have to be as strict as that? Do we have to, do we leave it to individual journalists' discretion or editors, or do we make it, more a whole media organization taking a stand on that? But clearly, they need to think about these things. So women are present in every category. So the farmers issue also came up. We talked about women farmers, and it was interesting that in the early study talked about there were a substantial farmers' wives and daughters, but these also farmers. Then also, how can we avoid episodic framing of an issue? And the media's tendency to report on single women's narratives of victory or suffering, rather than on framing issues related to them in terms of larger systemic and policy discrimination and abuse. Importantly, can we change this picture in the mainstream press and television, of course, and not just on selective digital or online platforms or on news pages, not just on opinion pages, where the picture is a bit, the picture is more heartening. Definitely, we look at opinion pages, we look at online platforms, but can we change it in the mainstream? And I hope we can discuss all these questions collectively and find answers together, because I don't have all the answers. But clearly, one way is really training, because I think when we have approached training, because I do a lot of training on sexual violence, individual journalists are very receptive to it. And you realize, you keep saying training is not a once in your lifetime you do it. You have to keep doing it regularly with different groups all across newsrooms, from people who are on the desk to this thing, because you need to understand structures of power, whatever, and system issues. So that is, it's open for discussion now.
Thank you so much, Sameera. I think that your talk title is a misnomer. It should have been not quite half the story, because I looked at this, the percentages that you read out a little while ago just shocked me. I'm not thinking beyond that. And also it made me realize how much of a bubble I live in, because all I've heard of in the last 3 years is gender. But you're telling us that in the mainstream, there was no coverage at all. So I'm thinking I need to stop doing this work and start sitting down to read newspapers more. But thank you so much. I think that was as illuminating as it was shocking. And I know there's already a question in the chat box, so I will just yield very quickly to others. This is from Vandana K. You mentioned that health stories about women focused on an individual or an episode, but lacked a gender perspective. What do you mean by that? How can a journalist bring in a gender perspective?
Okay, that's a very good question. Yeah, so it's very simple. It's actually, so when you do an individual perspective, this happens in sexual crime, it's happening in like I told the pregnancy stories, in COVID. It becomes a story of this individual woman, age 34, who is in a situation, who's in a crisis. Now you talk about her, you quote her husband, you quote her mother-in-law, and you say how bad it is, and her doctors were rude, something. Now it's only about her. You keep thinking that the story is only about her and her pregnancy, and something's going wrong, that she's not getting the facility. But the larger perspective, it happens to a lot of women. When we started looking at the coverage in May and June, there were lots of stories. happening across the country to pregnant women and childbirth issues. So when we start adding dots together, you start saying this is a way how women are treated when they're pregnant. What are the facilities they get? What is your state services? What is your central government offering? What are the services which should have been offered? Now, this is, of course, was the pandemic scenario, so it changes things. But even otherwise, regular coverage. We are so based on this individual girl raped. We're so busy on this woman molested, or the one individual story. If we don't have a larger story, this is happening to a lot of people. What is the facility provided by the state? What are women as a larger collective doing? Who are the gender experts and stuff? Whether it's on public spaces or safety or assaults or on healthcare issues of women, maternal mortality, child care, whatever. So the larger issue of systemic this thing. So the gender perspective comes in when you look at a system is responsible for this. The many other areas you need to be looking at. It's not just this one story. It's a very easy journalism. You go in, you say, oh, this one little woman, whatever. If you have data, if some non-profit group has done good data on maternal health or whatever, that's great because often journalists are now pulling in data. That's very interesting. But then they're not making sense of it. So if this is happening all at East Ward. East Ward is one poorest ward in Bombay, which is a very rich city. Why are women still dying? Why is the maternal health so poor? This is an area not very far from where I live. Why are women still in such crisis with regard to maternal health? Why are resources not pulled more into this ward? So what are the other points of reflection? You look at what the figure, the data, the money being spent. Do you have enough clinics? Do you have enough health posts? So the many other angles need to come in. So all I mean is have the individual story, but pull away from this individual story and start looking at other things responsible. What are the data for the larger region, for whatever data, yes, but voices, and there are lots of experts all across. We have the expertise. There are lots of things available. You have to pull yourself apart and say, okay, I want to look at the issues that are larger. So bring in all these things. Because all this shows that policy is not fair towards women always. That's what we're trying to say. That's a gender perspective. But what is the policy of this? So it's a great question. And I think it's a little more work. But if you're covering a beat regularly, you normally have these, you're covering education. You come and have this. The education comes to cover the education of all students. Education, there are students who are minority students, there are women students, there are differently able students, there are all kinds of students. So there are different groups of students. So you can't say a general education policy. What is happening for these groups? Can they access their schools? Do they have digital devices? So all these other angles when you bring in a much more robust perspective. Thank you.
A question from Lalita Suhasini. For independent journalists, pitch gender stories is also difficult. I've heard editors discuss this when I was a full-time editor as well. And when freelancers pitch stories that are focused on women, say, please let us not get into this gender issue all the time. How can newsrooms get sensitized?
Yeah, I totally get you, Lalita. It's really, it is a problem. So we have to now maybe we collectively use our brains for how do we sort of take an issue. One is that, all stories have gender perspective. So the point is if you're doing the farmers movement or you're doing, education, health, yes, but even policy, budget, politics, everything. And I think it's even in regular stories, bring in women's voices. So I think that very, very simple thing is, it's not so simple because you have to rewire your brain a little bit, is so you're doing the, like budget stories have started, but they'll bring in a very specific, what does the housewife think of the budget? The gas bill going up. Or when you do, but even about, so I think it's just bringing voices in a story where you don't expect women's voice necessarily. So I think whether you're covering, so even if it's not a gender specific affecting women, but affecting more people than this woman, I think just bring in voices. So it could be the chief minister makes a statement on something. Okay, we have perspective from male expert, a female expert, ordinary person, female. You can have experts, but not experts as well. So as you're interviewing the man on the street, interview the woman on the street. Interview, whatever, on any of you, on education, on China invading our borders, whatever. I think cheap Chinese goods taking, whatever. So anything you think, okay, so China invading borders, you say, but they're just people. But if I saw a woman, and then in that woman category, which is very big, again, know there are different kinds of women. Some women are much more marginalized than others. If you can bring, so you have to do it gradually. I'm not saying all your stories you have to dump. So the BBC, what I'm saying is 50% in any story has to be women sources. So now that's a very strange. I'm not saying we will start. Can we start aiming that we represent all sections as much as possible in any story you're doing. So you're doing a story, whatever, you plan your expert sources, but if all your expert sources are men, are there no women available? Can we bring them? So the story doesn't have to be gender specific. But it doesn't answer your question, but how do you do what there are stories which are gender specific, really affect one gender more than others. So what do we do about that? I don't know. I think that I hate to say this, but this is my training. The times will tell you, how do you sexify it? So how do you put another spin on it in a way that that editor passes it? It passes muster, where you sort of, somehow put another, the way you present the story maybe. But it's not possible in all stories. So I find it very difficult to answer this because I know how much you hit your head against it. So I want to keep persevering and then find maybe, सीधी हिंदी में कहते हैं सीधी उंगली से घी नहीं निकले तो उल्टी उंगली. You really have to find another way into that story, which will look more acceptable, but you will get in your voices, the perspective, whatever. It can happen. But it's about paying attention. So I think a lot of journalists are willing to do that. And I think you'll just be reminded of that. So I find in training, most people are receptive. They come up with their own ideas. They're quite good. So I think it's nice to have workshops where we can come up and say, on this issue, what are the two stories we could write? So I do it a lot with my sexual violence training thing. For example, looking at the Shakti Mills case. I mean, this is what they did coverage of the first 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, first week. What else could you have done? What were the other coverages you could have done? Rather than just park your OB vans outside the hospital where the survivor is recovering. You just parked it for a week. But was that the answer? But what are the other stories you could do from that? And not just individualizing to just the Shakti Mills case, but can you now take the lens a little further and say, what else could we have looked at? So for example, we do that as a project when I'm teaching, looking at, let's build up other story ideas, other sourcing, other ways where you can get past these gatekeepers.
I think that, over the years, one of the things that I've learned to value the most with journalists who call up for quotes are the ones that call when there isn't a story, that just want to talk about an issue. They're not necessarily writing 500 words by 2 o'clock. But I think that that's the most, and a lot of us will be open to that. I'm saying this because we're going to place this recording online. I think people shouldn't hesitate to reach out and engage and build those connections so that when they need the quote, when they want the source, there are people that they can reach out to very quickly. There's a comment from Shweta saying, that's an important observation by Sameera, that journalists need to pull out from individual problems to systemic issues, going beyond the easiest available information and do a bit of homework to add facts that highlight the holes that need to be plugged in. And earlier there was a comment by Kannan M. Thank you for bringing this fact in front of us. We never realized the portrait of news media in this perspective.
Yeah, and thank you, Shweta. Shweta Singh is, really the rapes report. She is the main lead, project lead on that. And I couldn't have done the COVID-19 report, which is a massive enterprise, without her.
Vandana says, I do see Sameera's point, but I also think the whole individual-centric story has to do with how we are taught to write, not just daily news, but also features. Start with an individual because people relate to people, zoom out, provide context, bring in the experts, and then circle back to the individual with her hope, plans, etc.
No, I agree, Vandana. Yes, definitely. This is school journalism I went to and the anecdotal lead and, starting with that. So I'm not saying you would necessarily do away with that. I'm just saying that we need to not only focus on the individual. So maybe a certain breaking story will focus on individuals. But when you're doing a larger story, can you bring in other voices? Can you bring in other things and perspective? If you're doing that, you're starting with the individual, but also getting to other areas, that's not a problem. You're bringing other experts, you're bringing other data, that's not a problem. My problem is when you just get restricted that. And I particularly see in sexual violence stories, we just stuck on that one case and we think there's no other woman being assaulted in this country at all. So, we don't look at the larger, issue that. So I'm saying do a mix of it. Don't just get stuck on the individual narrative and make it out to be that individual girl or that happened to this individual woman. She's living in poverty. No, it's you need to look at the larger.
Which also makes it look like an exceptional incident.
Exactly, it does. They almost like this beta. There's on the TV. There's also one more woman. I mean, come on. Many of these are, let's draw lines to what, just expand it more. That's a big, yeah.
Kanan M says, I also observed that politicians-driven news media just extrapolate women's issues, rape cases, and underplay their corruption cases. But there's a question as well from Ridula Chari. I cover development and public policy from the lens of human rights. Often government officials are men. I try to bring in women's voices as experts or as people affected by these policies. But is there a way to push for a gender perspective from the point of view of the government? That's an interesting
Okay. Thanks, Mridula. So Mridula is an old student of mine from this. So we've done journalism together. But yeah, I agree with you. There is a problem when there are men in charge of these things. So what do? You have to get those official voices every men. So of course you'll have to get them in. That's not a problem. It's not about getting. Point of view of the government. So non-profit, you're right. From academic sources we can get from non-profit, we can get in other voices, women experts to balance that made for the government. But from the government point of view, it's difficult. It's probably not impossible because in areas where women are in charge. But sadly enough, I have not seen that perspective even when women ministers are in charge or whatever. Often women ministers do not give a gender point of view either. Let me just give a very the government point of view, patriarchal point of view. So that's the problem. How do you find one Mohammetra everywhere or something like that? You can't. So you, I don't know. That's actually a good question. How do you have the government's part when you don't? So I think as much about people close to government in very policy making things, policy making units who are doing that kind of work. If you can find women's sources there, or it doesn't also always have to be a women's source. So, there could be a male source, but he's offering a gender perspective on, but pushing them for is difficult. So some stories or some parts of the story cannot be but this thing. But I think that maybe this balance story in other ways, and keep pushing for it where you find these. So I think it's just being open to see, okay, this is change in the ministry. These are the people. These are the women, or these male sources actually give a different point of view. They open up the perspective much more from the regular. So I think keep looking out for those people, particularly in official positions where we can't choose too much. And maybe balancing with people from the unofficial, from academia and from, whatever, non-profits or whatever, activists, those groups, balance it with that. But that is tough till we see more changes.
I think one of the stories, I think Mridula's question is really interesting. One of the stories within that story is actually how gendered the structures of government themselves are. So, I mean, there is the issue that you are covering, and then there is sort of the backstory or the feature of how, I mean, if you have a development block project that is completely administered by people who have nothing to do with that particular problem. I mean, that's also a story in itself, and maybe making that transparent is another way of engendering the story that you're looking at. But Chindu Sridharan has a comment and question. It's interesting to note that despite all the gender education and sensitization we've seen in the last decade, that these trends continue. I'm curious to know your take on why this is not percolating into the news media. Are there specific constraints or situations that are stopping journalists from adopting a more sensitive attitude, looking beyond patriarchal mindsets?
Okay, first of all, I want to thank Chindu Sridharan for being here and for doing such amazing work. I have printed out your whole online report and I refer to it. Your great UNESCO report. It's a really good one and very detailed, I have to say. And we have referenced this in studies. I have referenced it when I write. Thank you so much for that work. I agree with you. We've been doing a lot of work on, I think, but this gender education sensitization is not enough in newsrooms. So, for example, I do a lot of training with Ladli and public, with groups of journalists, new journalists, even we do older journalists. We keep trying. Our tough part is not getting the younger journalists. They are, it's getting them, the ones who are stuck at the middle levels of journalism in their newsrooms to come out and, come for the workshop. And I'm a big votary, and this is what I really want to do. And if we can do it together, great. We need to get into newsrooms, not get them to come out to a Ladli training or whatever, because I do a lot of training on this. But I want to, and we've had a very tough time getting newsrooms in the Times of India, Hindustan Times, can I come to your newsroom? Can you give me a conference room? Can we do this regularly? Can we put it on the agenda for the year? Because you can be reminded when the journalists come for like these population first, that these, well, at least before, yeah, I think they've done it also during COVID. These workshops where they get a whole group of journalists, which are older journalists and younger journalists, together for a retreat. We've done a retreat of 3 days somewhere, where they're all discussing these issues of how to cover gender. We get it through. And I keep seeing those people sometimes come back and talk to me or call me up. And you can see a different story initially, but you keep saying training, but retraining and sensitization is a constant process through the year. And not just reporters and people who are writing, but also people in the desk and senior editors. They keep thinking they don't need it. I keep telling them, no, you need to understand there are a lot of difference in perspective. So they're not, it's just a mindset just saying, I kind of know it. I'm senior. Why take my junior reporter for training? No, but you all need it, because if the junior reporter comes to you, just as Lalita said, with a story idea, we say, gender, we don't. But how and how you can actually, and my whole thing is makes for good journalism. You want good stories. If you want good stories, and not just in actually, I do training with sexual violence, but what about training in environment or health or whatever, all kinds of politics, how to cover it with different lenses, gender being one lens, but a caste lens, a class lens. How we need to, regular training in a newsroom, you should be pulling a journalist and saying, you need to go into this little room we have here where we're having training constantly. Someone needs to be trained. And seniors, definitely, you need editors to understand when we're presenting the COVID report, Nadi had a big sort of online, we had the editor, the resident of the Hindustan Times in Bombay, he said, I didn't think when we were factoring in data coming in, community, we didn't factor in that these other lenses need to come in as well. I mean, he said it publicly. So it was very interesting. So I realized that in a story, I need to start thinking of the other groups as well coming in, and it makes for a good story. End of the day, what editors want is good stories. And there are great stories. If you bring in these perspective stories, richer, deeper, extended. So I think there's not enough gender sensitivity. People think they have it all. They come into a newsroom and they think, I'm such a professional journalist. I'm not carrying any baggage of caste and class and patriarchy on my shoulders. I'm professional. And I keep saying, first confront your biases, which is okay, and then put it aside and then be open to be retrained in that. But I think they've not gone past there because they're not willing to be trained. But they want good stories, and I keep telling them, it's good stories. It'll lead to good stories, and then they like. You give me story ideas, they like that. So, let's discuss story ideas, and then whatever. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
This is actually one area where impact trickles down, because I think that when you have, whether it's journalists or any other sector where you're doing gender training, when the leadership of an organization attends the training and shows a buy-in and takes at least one little thing out of that, that has a larger impact than if they only keep sending in people at the point of induction who have no power to make decisions and, whose pitches may not get accepted. So this is one area where I think starting from the top actually makes a little bit of sense. So, any other questions? Yeah,
may I offer an observation as well? Sure. I did wonder, I think this is a question again to you, not a question, but maybe something that you can comment on. Yes, training the journalists and training the journalism leadership is absolutely critical. But also looking into building something a little more sustainable. I was wondering, and this is happening at some point in education, but I wondered whether you felt, I know that you do teach as well, and many of the colleagues here are also educators. But I did wonder whether there was a need for a deeper intervention, educational intervention in journalism schools, in the universities, so that the curriculum is also reflecting these things, so that you're training the new generation of. My initial feeling at this point of time, working across university, yes, there are universities who come out with media-sensitive modules or certain degrees as well, but these are kind of ticking a box to some extent because it's okay, fine, we have to be gender sensitive. I did wonder whether there should be, number one, a deeper intervention, and if so, what is it that we can do together to have that intervention deep enough to be sustainable?
I totally agree with you. And I think I really keep telling people who do run journalism courses, you can't just be teaching the craft of journalism and just think technique and style of writing or, or equipment if you're doing broadcast or whatever. It's so much more. What are you going to report more and what are the lens you're going to take to that perspective? So, for example, the college I taught for the longest while journalism was School of Media and Culture Studies at TISS. And because TISS of the kind of reputation TISS has itself, TISS is culture, and the school, the 2-year master's, it's called media and culture studies. And the idea is to bring in all kind of other lenses and training to understand gender, caste, class, and you're taught to interrogate that. Besides, of course, this is generally general sort of atmosphere. But I think this needs to go into others. I think that really changes the way students are doing journalism then. I'm very proud of many of my students who have gone in to do very interesting and ask those interesting questions because they've been taught to train, they've been trained in a way of that, you need to look at all these perspectives. So I think that's very important. And I'm seeing these media courses mushrooming all over the place, which is these private college ones who are not bringing, you're right, there's one class, I sometimes get called to come and do one class on gender-bias coverage. And that's not enough. I mean, and gender is a much more larger thing. There's only one, or there's so many other areas you can, and I keep trying to tell them that this actually makes for the better professionals. Actually, they come out with much better stories, much more well-rounded stories. So because that is the end result, that's really what is interesting. So you're taught to question all these things you come in with. I agree with you. I think journalism schools need to add this much more deeply into their curriculum, but also general, this goes even beyond journalism. I think it's even, maybe undergrad in other ways, dismantle this because we also need to train our readers to read differently, or viewers differently. So they need to be also. So I think in undergrad institutions, at least you can, get in bringing these. I think some places are taking it, but yeah, it's a little token service. It's not enough. And I think actually Shweta Singh can address that more because Shweta Singh actually teaches at a college in Delhi. She's a professor of media studies.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Sameera. I just wanted to add here, like for me, it is some kind of an everyday thing where I am trying to push a case for a more gender diverse representation of sorts at all levels of administration and academia and these management structures. So I usually see it is the privileged caste men, even if there are issues which are quite serious enough when it's about someone who is adversely affected as a, and has a gender concern out there. Even there, it's so difficult to get a few more women on different panels, So invariably, these are privileged caste men who are there. And just to make a case that we need for a diverse structure is such an immense task because your question, are you going against the rules? Are you going against the BOS structures, the statutes, the ordinances? Are you questioning the system? Are you questioning the vice chancellor? Do you think the best? That kind of a thing. So, where is it written that you need a diverse representation of sorts? So, those voices that you want to bring in, it's kind of an everyday thing at all these levels. One. And the second thing is that when we are working on the syllabus, so I try to be very proactive in bringing in gender perspective. So for a very long time, say in the paper for communication theory, we didn't have a feminist perspective on communication theories. So we try to incorporate the feminist perspectives on communication theories, whatever we can. So, those small little things matter. I mean, I think putting a separate paper on gender itself will take a very long time because, the pressure is already very huge. We are trying to bring in human rights, environments, everything. So what we need to do is maybe teach the same things with a bit of more of gender sensitivity and not miss out those opportunities where we can incorporate those small little things that just alter the perspective of those courses. So, and of course, I do not miss out on an opportunity to remind my students to attend sessions like these. So some of my students are already here listening. So I think that also goes a long way. So those are my thoughts.
Shall I read out Vandana's follow-up comment? Let's say you also emphasized the importance of using data. Let's say I want to do a story on household air pollution and women's health. There is data on how many people die from household air pollution, but there is no data on how many women die from this, not from the government or non-profits or think tanks. But editors want data for such stories or else they lose interest. How then do I pursue such a story?
Yeah, this is an issue when you don't get gender disaggregated data on certain things. And they said, but all data is all general, it covers everybody. And you want to say, but the thing, women are getting less hospitalized and men are getting, but then you need to have data to show them. And journalists are not going to do all the data collection. This is a worrying thing, but I'm just saying, assuming this story, I mean, yeah, if they want pure raw data, this is going to be difficult for journalists, but assuming household air pollution, who stays in the household maximum number of hours, and which is the woman, if it's a kind of fossil fuel kind of sort of, you don't have gas, you're burning coal and you're cooking on angiti, whatever, you're cooking on that open fire, then who is doing that job? And assuming that what constitutes household air pollution in this specific case, what are the devices to cause household air pollution? If it is a stove, then who is doing the responsibility with regard to the stove and cooking? If there's one particular gender doing it, one particular gender in the house all the time, chances the figures really refer to that particular gender. So, but you have to make the extrapolation, but obviously with the help of an expert who agrees with you that you can do it that way. But you said, no, I want exactly, this is the percentage of this, how much are men, how much are women. But then that's up to the research study, but there's no research study supporting that for you. Maybe you can look at, cross-reference from another country. Another Asian country has done it. Another South Asian country has done it. You can look at data from there. So you need to bring in other forms of data, not maybe from that specific constituency, but others supporting this and experts saying, but you can read this. So the figure says this, we mean actually, chances are very high that this is the percentage of the women affected. So I think you have to find other ways, because you can't then go and do the research project of, looking at widening your research scope, look at other studies, but also talk to experts who interpret this study in a much more gender holistic way. So for this study, but it is difficult. I mean, this is one example, but in some places it's difficult because we found that with the COVID, if there's no gender disaggregated data, they're saying, how do we know women are suffering more as a result of that? So, what is interesting with the domestic violence thing and COVID pandemic was you suddenly kept saying, okay, now women are not out, there are no crimes against women, because the media's perspective on crimes against women has been crimes in public and by strangers. That's what the lens they've been putting. Though for years, National Crime Records Bureau puts out statistics saying that the bulk of the assaults of women is in private spaces and by people they know. That is the reality in India and many other countries. And that has been for a long time. But it's interesting how the media cover, you ask someone, where do crimes happen against women? It's always in the public and always by strangers, which is a very smaller proportion. So then you need to say, but suddenly in the pandemic, this changed because the women were not out there. They were not the strangers. They were being assaulted in the home. Many were complaining, or non-profits brought it up. They were doing research of women. So when you brought it up, then suddenly you talk the hidden pandemic. It's been a hidden pandemic, domestic violence for a long time. It just got really, much more gritty because everybody was at home and it was very much more apparent in your face. But it's not that domestic violence had gone away somewhere. So so those, but we don't have enough of that gender. So in violence we do actually. That's been the attention paid on that. But in other areas, environment, of flood or famine, how they're affecting women and girls, this we don't have enough. And I think we talk on conversation, push, maybe researchers need to start looking at that. And there are changes, there are gender perspectives coming into the research, but not fast enough.
I turned off my video because my internet is shaky. Mridula has a question. How would you recommend bringing the idea of masculinity and patriarchy to reporting on gender? As you both said, sometimes it helps to put the spotlight on the structures of power. Would it be by bringing a voice to talk about how, say, a policy does not include women, or pointing out lack of access to a space? I sometimes struggle with doing this without editorializing. Can relate to the last sentence. I often struggle with not hitting people on the head with.
No, particularly a news story where you're writing your opinion column, that's one thing to hit people. But in a main story, you want your sources to tell it, or some data in a story. You want the story itself to tell it so clearly that you don't have to It's just the way who you've interviewed, what data you looked at. Yeah, I think that you try all kinds of techniques. I don't have a pat answer for that. As for most questions, these are questions which we need to keep reflecting on. Yeah, a voice is an easier way we can say, but particularly if you can find policy which do not include women, or implementation of the policy. The policy may include women, but the implementation of the policy, you can clearly see it is having a different effect on women and men. So all these things what you point out, great, pointing out lack of access to space. Yeah, I think all these kinds of things we can do. I think you have to find a balance between. And sometimes you have to maybe bring in your voice and focusing on the writing a more little opinionated piece, but also if you can draw it from sources, policy, data, it would be better. It's somehow some people keep thinking that's not the or lived experience of people or whatever. So I think you need to bring in different things, try different things with it. But I don't have a bad answer for this. I think what you're suggesting is actually very good ways of how do you bring in these? Because proving systemic bias and proving it's easy, okay. So Section 377 said something very clearly for these things. So it's easier to talk about that law being discriminatory, this thing out of touch with the times, all that stuff, and enough groups lobbying to and having voices. So, but some other issues are not so easy and clear. So you need to just look at a lot of data sets, look at a lot of policies, and just find different ways. So for different stories, you have to try different ways. Some will be voices, some will be policy, but just tearing these apart. And some of them are not easy, especially if other groups have not done it. You're the only journalist doing it. Is just keep looking at it and with this open questioning mind. I think just keep that on. That's it. If anybody else has a better suggestion, I would like to know.
Other questions, comments from the floor? I think one of the things, if you were a working journalist, that would really help, Sameera, is to have circles of people that you can talk some of this through with. And I'm doing this, people that you trust not to pick up your story and, that sort of thing. You can actually talk about this and find alternative ways. And I'm hoping that a lot of young journalists have that. But I suspect, judging from other fields of work, that they probably don't. But that would be something that would really make a difference, I think, to suggesting the Teri Ungli route that you may not think of.
Yeah, there's a tearing. Yeah, that comes with conversation, actually, really conversation. And I really believe cross-generational talk between journalists is very important.
Yes.
Older and younger journalists. Really, it really helps. And I have to say the Network Women in Media India, which I need to plug it again, because it's a group I'm very proud of. We all had found it, but it's just it's an amazing group, and that's the whole idea of the network. Women media is basically to bring women journalists across generations and across So people are practicing community radio to mainstream publications, digital media. People across different publications, languages, different parts of the country, and we have conversations. So obviously you can't discuss one story with the whole group, but you definitely can find your little allies in that larger group. It's been very useful. I find NWMI, particularly for freelance women journalists, it's really something which really keeps us rooted and together. And someone has your back in that. And that's why we're talking about these issues all the time, about training, retraining, having workshops. And we work so much with NWMI has worked with Prajnya so often. But I really think please find a mentor, a senior mentor, and please find if you're younger journalist, please find a mentor in the field, and please find these networks of solidarity. They're very useful, not only when you're being trolled on social media, which is one of the things we constantly take up, but also otherwise to think through some of these issues, because they're not being thought of in the newsroom enough, and then you don't have places. One of the reasons we said, the press clubs are for drinking, and what do we do then when we want to talk about the important issues of media? Which affect, some are gender related, but some are not. Some are just about issues. So, yes.
Two questions, one from Ridula and one from Chindu Sridharan.
Okay, yeah.
About marginalized genders, I find there is a huge disconnect between language use in elite urban English-speaking spaces compared to other spaces. What are ways I can try to include their perspectives and stories too, without bringing in my own position as a reporter with a lot of privilege and access to elite spaces? I feel that often I don't try hard enough to include people of marginalized genders. And if I may, I will also read out Chindu Sridharan's questions so you can take them one after the other. I wondered if the over-reliance on official sources that news media taps as default can be consciously circumvented, and journalists actively look out for alternate sources. There is some evidence around this in peace journalism studies, I think.
Yeah, so just to take Chindu's first, because Midula's is more complicated, I think I totally agree with you. I think we need to, I think there's certain stories, particularly, and usually really the breaking stories, when something really major is breaking, where you need to look at an official source and editor will not clear it if you don't have. So if you're in the newsroom kind of reporter, it's different. You need much more, you need official source, even just to say no comment. You need the official sources. But yes, to actively cultivate very much, and I don't understand in the days of computers, where you can't, people have black books and you have your book of contact, but you can really keep people under, you can really actively look at all these different kinds of sources and sort of, have a ready reckoner. If you're, and particularly cover a particular beat, you will have access, you have regular access to it. For example, like even with sexual violence reporting, keep telling people, why don't we have a thing on your computer which tells you words to avoid? I mean, for example, I'm just talking about in a different sense, but also sources you need. Also gender-related sources, there's not one person who's a gender expert. Some people are gender experts on gender and employment. Some are gender and environment. Some are experts on sexual violence. So there are different kinds of gender experts. One of them keeps saying, don't hit a gender expert for everything, one gender expert. So you need to have these subcategories of people who speak more on certain kinds of, on Dalits and women or whatever. But and multiple types. Some come from point of view of literature and academia. Some talk with regard to something like politics or something. So you need to get out and get all these, because these people very inform and can also point you in the right direction to look at information and data, whatever. So I agree. I think actively cultivating any beat you're covering, all kinds of other sources. And I think that because media, social media, whatever, cell phones really make it easy to access all these people, and the internet makes it easier. You need to really cultivate, and even when there's no active story happening, get in touch with these people and talk to them about their work, their research. There's very interesting research happening in institutions of higher learning, but we don't know enough as journalists as to what all these people are producing and how much of them have, are to do with, say, marginalized people or, other genders or whatever. So I think you have access to this. Can we work out a link between academia and journalists? Where this I've been thinking for a long time, where we can see what kind of research is happening and plug in, not just one or two professors who talk a lot about their work, but what were the others? What are they doing? What are their students working on? What are they, whatever. So I think that's really important to build all these other networks. Midula, there's no easy answer. I agree. I think it's hard to bring in. It's not impossible, but it's hard till you start to consciously try to bring in these other voices of marginalized genders into your story. So I think first we need to build much more links as journalists with these with people marginalized and particularly their groups, because many of them are very informed and they are networked and they have groups, but to get into those groups and have access to them, build a database. So you have to actually do this really in lull time when you're not actively pursuing a story actually, but you're building these relationships with them and finding out what their concerns, and actually maybe the story comes from them. You don't have to go with the agenda or a story. So I think it's just finding out, okay, who are the groups who are dealing with in my city, dealing with trans women's issues, whatever, trans people's issues in general, or with your community, or the smaller groups, the bigger groups. Sometimes the groups are odds at each other. But who are these people? Who are people researching this or writing on it? So I think you would do it in a lull time when we actually don't have an active story we're chasing, is to start building this connection with these. And unfortunately, because your media institutions are not doing it if you work full time. You have to do it individually, Johnson, build these contacts, look for them, and talk to them about what's happening. And then maybe sometimes the idea comes from them, and then they are there on your roster when you go out looking for stories, when you're doing a story, active story. So this has to, it has to just be an active project of ours. That's as journalists.
And to that, I would actually add, Sameera, that at Prajnya, for example, we often invite journalists to our programs, but we don't want coverage. Because coverage, 200 words on the 5th page is of no use to anybody. And what I would rather have is the person just sit there and listening and, absorbing, maybe making friends with a few people at the seminar, because that's the investment we all want to make in people, in the media. We want people to have the opportunity to absorb and learn without the pressure of writing a story. And, when we make those invitations, I really appreciate the editors who understand what it is and send somebody, and the journalists who, when we send out the invitation, understand it, just come and listen. It isn't always about getting coverage. In fact, it's usually not about getting coverage when we do the invitation, because that's a very short-term, limited, and for the kind of work that many of us do, pointless goal. What is much more important is to build, to contribute, to have someone access a conversation that they may not otherwise be able to listen to when they just come in for the bite and go off.
Actually, Chindu, I had a very good example of that, of this academia and journalists sort of contact. I noticed it particularly missing the story of the 2012 gang rape of Jyoti Singh Pandey. The issue of the juvenile, the juvenile perpetrator. And the media went hammer and tongs and they're saying this guy is few months short of 18, he should be tried. And of course, then now the juvenile justice law has changed as a result of that case. But they kept saying, what is this? What is juvenile justice? What is, why does he get less than others? And why does he get to go to a juvenile justice home versus jail? And, and they went hammer and tongs without any understanding. That was the perfect moment someone say, wait a minute, there must be someone doing work on juvenile justice norms in India. There could be, why can't you approach an institution like this or JNU where people may be working with these things and who have done maybe, theses on this, papers on this, and have a thinking or work with these homes. They never went to the experts on juvenile justice to talk about what the law was, what needed change, what didn't need change, what the law meant something, but in practice it worked differently. You didn't want younger, people accused of crime to become hardened criminals, so that there's a logic for the juvenile justice law, but also the juvenile justice institution be run in a particular way. Do people come back from issue of reform and legal justice? But they didn't get in experts. It was on television with talking points of politicians talking about juvenile justice, ordinary people talking, everybody talking about the experts on juvenile justice. They were not there. So, and this is one of the things. Why don't you approach, these, this, for example, has a full course on, looking at, you do the master in social work on a criminal issues. So you're not looking at these people, you're not asking them the right, the right experts, and then weighing in, and then the law was trying to be changed. I didn't see any experts talking on TV, on print, having the points of view, writing a more popular paper from the academic research saying these are the things. Very few when someone intervened on this thing. And so we eventually have passed a law saying on certain crimes, everybody will be treated as a hardened criminal and, as an adult, but without a clear understanding of data coming in or research or expert voices. So the media just went hammer and tongs and didn't bother. But there was a clear case. Listen, we need to talk expert. We are not the experts on this. But they refused to acknowledge that they were not experts. So I think these associations really need to be built and very actively. And journalists need to pursue this. That was an example.
Lalita Suhasini writes, I teach journalism at Flame University. One of the things I've consciously tried to do is invite women journalists to teach things like photography, data journalism, and so on, to draw attention to things that were discussed earlier. How do we focus on women when there isn't enough data on women and so on? Thank you so much for bringing again again for bringing this link between academia and journalism. Happy to incorporate other things that I should be doing as an educator as well. It's now noon and we usually close right on time. So at that point, I will say thank you to you all for coming and making this such a lively, one of the liveliest sessions we've had in this series, actually. And that, of course, is in no small measure because of Sameera's wonderful presentation and just her enthusiastic presence. Just so grateful and happy to have you here. Come back soon, Sameera, and thank you so much for doing this and for all the effort you put into making this presentation as rich and full and shocking as it was. Thank you so much. Come back soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prajnya.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.